Thank you very much, Nicole, and good afternoon, everybody. The beef industry trifecta. So this is actually a presentation that I gave originally at the Australian Rangelands Conference last year in Longreach in early October, and I've revisited the presentation, updated it to present today. So I'll get underway, and I guess initially I'd like to acknowledge. I'd like to acknowledge two producers in the Charters Towers area that actually gave me some valuable feedback and critique on this presentation. Roger Landsberg, the owner and manager of Trifecta Pastoral Company, and Tom Mann, the previous owner of Hillgrove Pastoral Company, now retired in Charters Towers. Both these families managed what I regard as strongly economically viable and environmentally sustainable beef businesses for a long time, and in both cases for several generations. And it's been a real pleasure to work with these two families and to receive that feedback from specifically from Roger and Tom. So what is the beef industry trifecta? Well, it's not really rocket science. It's simply an alignment of good seasons with low interest rates and high beef prices. And obviously all three of them at the same time. So the area that this presentation is based on is what I've called Northern Australia. And so first of all, looking at the rainfall side of the trifecta, it's basically looking at that area that's north of the South Australian Northern Territory border, but that line extended east to Bundaberg and west to Carnarvon. So you can see it's quite a big swag of Australia. And the rainfall decile, so this is just a way of presenting rainfall data in rather than absolute totals or numbers of millimetres per annum in terms of what it's like in comparison to broader trends and other attributes of rainfall. So, for example, this 1996 is the decile 5 year, which is a median year or around the average. As opposed to the year 2000, which was a cracker of a season across vast areas of Australia, a decile 10 year, and 2003 decile 4, and I'll keep going. So there's a lean year in 2005, another mediocre to better year in 2007, and another quite good year, a decile 9 in 2018. And you'll notice that even in those higher decile years like that last one in 2018, it's not as if every part of that whole Northern Australia area had a good season. So when you're looking at deciles across vast areas like this, there's going to be a lot of regional variability in there in terms of some people have had a cracker of a season, other people have had a terrible season. So if we look, and I'll explain in a little while why I've selected the years between 1996 and 2021. But if we look at the deciles for that 26-year run, and I'd like to thank David Arends from the Department of Environment and Science for crunching the rainfall data to generate that information, you can see from 96 to 21, there have been probably more years above the median, which was a decile 5 year, than there has been below. If you took the whole run of the available rainfall data across all those same centres, you would find there would be equal numbers of years above decile 5 and equal numbers below decile 5. But in that 26-year run, there's been more above. So that's the rainfall. If we look at Reserve Bank interest rates over the same period, and you can see that from 1996 through to the global financial crisis in 2008, Reserve Bank interest rates were between 5 and 7%. After the GFC, the global financial crisis, interest rates dropped fairly dramatically and continued to go down to the point where they were down at 0.25% last year. If we look at an indicator of cattle prices, I've selected the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator for the same period, and this is the main reason I selected those years, because the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator only became available in 1996, so that's why I've selected 1996 through to 2021. And you can see that it's quite low back in '96, and I should say that all these values are corrected to $20, so they're a real comparison. So in 1996, the price is down quite a bit. It did kick, but then it fluctuated around quite a bit till 2014. Took a kick, another dip until 2019, and then it's been an uphill run ever since then. And I think today the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator is around 1,090 cents. So it's just an astounding run. It's interesting that this week MLA announced a live export price indicator, or LEPI, which once we get a few months or a few years of data, will probably be a better price indicator for Northern Australian beef producers. So it's based on live export prices. So that's something to watch. We can, however, of course, go back further with cattle prices, and this is a yearling price, which is different from the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator. These prices are corrected to 2015, so we can't do a direct comparison between this and the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator. So they are in real dollar terms in 2015 dollars, and it's really interesting. You can see that the monumental crash in the beef industry in the mid 70s to the late 70s, but the prices either side of the crash were quite astounding. So if we roll all these together, what do we get? So you can see it's a bit of an horrendogram. So the grey bars are the rainfall, the orange line is the interest rates, and the blue line is cattle prices. And of course, you can see that the year that really did hit the trifecta was last year and continuing into this year. And there's no other year in that 26-year run where those three things have coincided. And I think if we went back to 71, looking at those prices I just had up a little while ago, we might have had some good seasons, but interest rates have never been lower in the history of the Commonwealth. So the trifectas, a really rare occurrence. I just now want to do a bit of a reality check, because things have changed since last year right through to April 2022, April this year. So first of all, with rainfall, this is actually rainfall once again in deciles, looking at the 4-month period from December last year to March this year. And while quite a few people had reasonable storm rain in December and January, the tap got turned off very dramatically at the start of February, and a lot of areas have had an extremely dry February and March. I know in Charters Towers, for example, where I'm based, February, March this year was the 6th lowest out of 141 years of rainfall records for Charters Towers. And the other thing that really cooled the pasture that did grow from the December-January rain, and a lot of people experienced this too, was an extreme heat wave in the first week of autumn. In the Towers, we had 9 consecutive days over 40 degrees, and that's an all-time record, once again, out of 141 years of climate data. So what little pasture we did grow really got scorched and burnt off. And so you could say, if we draw a line from Bundaberg through Winton to Tennant Creek to Wyndham, prior to this week or last weekend, we were all looking down the barrel of a really tough season. Very luckily, for once, the cavalry did come over the hill. And this is just these are actual rainfall registrations, not deciles, of the type of rainfalls received over the Anzac weekend, so like 5-day totals. Well, actually, it's April to the 26th of April, so the month to date. And that really has made a huge difference to the outlook for the season. And I think for anyone that did get this sort of rain, as I say, it covered a big area. The other thing that's in our favour is the Indian Ocean dipole is looking quite favourable, which means that temperatures, and particularly night temperatures, will stay up, or the probability of them staying up is higher through autumn and maybe into early winter. With high soil moisture levels, that'll augur well for quite good pasture growth at a time of year where, even if soil moisture was adequate, there may not have been all that much growth. So with modest pasture growth, the pasture will be extremely high quality, and there's potential to get very good animal production. But there's one important rider to that animal production. It's only if stocking rates on the paddocks and the properties that are managed for livestock are matched to carrying capacity. So with that rider, potentially there's some very good productions going to occur over probably the next month to 6 weeks. A report that Rabobank put out in early March talking about costs of production, and in part they said inflationary pressures are building in the beef supply chain, with labour, freight and energy costs amongst the largest to see increases, along with feed. So by feed they're talking primarily feedlots. Interest rates, the cash rate currently is unchanged, and it's been unchanged for a few months now at 0.1%, in other words, nearly zero. The forecast, so Westpac is saying by the end of this calendar year, the rate they're predicting is 1.25%. NAB, another 2 years down the track, predicting 2.25%. And inflation, of course, this week's been announced at 5%. So there are a few things there that are affecting the trifecta, but the trifecta, in my opinion, still exists. Just a look at some of the other costs that are vital to the extensive beef industry. Diesel prices have gone up quite dramatically, but went back a bit when the excise was taken off. Steel prices have jumped dramatically from $700 a tonne up to at present about $1,100 a tonne. The costs of urea, which is widely used in dry season supplements in the northern beef industry, from September last year, prices have doubled, and I heard something yesterday in the media that the prices have even gone quite a bit higher since this graph was last plotted, which was March last month. And the last one, of course, is the increase in values of grazing land, and this data is complements of Heron Todd White Rural. So this is for grazing properties in Queensland in excess of 5,000 hectares, goes right back to the year 2000. But if you look at the last bit of the graph from 1990 through to last year, there's about a 50% increase in land values, and they're dollars per hectare, and it's gone up a bit more ever since. So there's things that are happening, but suffice to say there are still opportunities out there. So let's get on to some of the options. So I think when you're assessing options, it's useful to have some sort of framework to actually make assessments by. And we talk about the 3 business needs, and the 3 business needs quite simply are whether an option or a proposal is technically sound. In other words, can it be done on your property or in your situation? The next one is the affordability, the business need affordability. So can it be financed? In other words, from your own resources, or is it realistic to borrow money to actually implement this particular option? And the last one, of course, and usually the most important one, is it profitable? So if it's technically feasible and I can afford to do it, am I going to make a quid out of it? And usually it's only if all 3 business needs are satisfied that you'll come up with an option that we'll call a can-do option. But it's important to realise that not all options may be profitable. So, for example, if we've got severe erosion areas like this, which are quite common on some of the frontages of major rivers right across northern Australia, there's no profit for a producer in trying to fix this up, but it's an important environmental issue. So some people may consider doing some work on these types of things. I'll talk a little bit more about them later on. So what are the options? Well, I guess the first one is just business as usual. But I think under the circumstances, adopting a business as usual approach is to a certain degree a missed opportunity. So I'd think at a minimum, there's an opportunity there to actually at least review your business, review your operation, and see if there are a few things you could do. I'm going to list another 6 options in a minute, but I think that it's not as if all these options are exclusive. So quite a few of them could be considered simultaneously, and in fact some of them will actually complement each other. So look for synergies if you're considering some of the options I'm going to highlight and some of the ones that you've developed or identified for yourself. So the first group of financial management options, the options of increasing long-term carrying capacity either on your property or across your herd. The options of upgrading infrastructure, they're, in my experience, around particularly Queensland, but also a bit into the Territory and into the Kimberley. there's an opportunity to upgrade infrastructure, and there's a lot of infrastructure that's in pretty sad condition. There are options and opportunities to improve the livestock side of the business, to improve environmental management in the business, and lastly but not least, to look at some of the options that are of benefit to family and staff. So I'm just going to go through the last 6, so number 2 to number 7, and flesh them out a little bit. So financial management options to start with. Initially, people that are carrying debt, the reaction might be to say, well, let's pay down debt. But I think unless property viability is in a fairly parlous state and it's crucial that debt be reduced, there may be better options for taking advantage of the beef industry trifecta. I mean, there could simply be an opportunity to highlight improved cash flow and greater equity to a bank manager and put the case for reduced margins on interest. I mean, I know RBR rates, Reserve Bank of Australia rates are very low, and your commercial rates are possibly down, but if you've got a margin on there, there could be an opportunity to put the case to your banker to have your margin reduced. Or you could even go one step further and look at the options of maybe consider a change of banking or banker. Your viability is most probably improved, so it's worth testing the market, seeing what else is out there. A lot of interactions with banks are done in their office. I would hazard a guess, and this was also suggested by Tom Mann. He said the best place to do negotiations with a banker is on your property as part of a property visit. So invite them out. They're on your turf. You'll be much more comfortable. And from my experience with agribusiness managers, they're usually keen to get out on property and have a look anyway. So there are other options in financial management, diversification. So whether it be something like other agricultural enterprises on the home property, and for people that maybe have access to irrigation along major watercourses across northern Australia, irrigated cropping could be an option, whether it be cattle feed, whether it be grain crops, whether it be intensive horticulture. And I guess as more intensive crops are taking on, it really requires a whole new level of expertise and management that probably comes from someone else that might be interested in running a intensive cropping or intensive irrigation business on your property. There's other things that are relevant to diversification still on property, things like on property or on station tourism. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but the people that are in it do it quite well. There's also the off-property investments, and there's a huge range. So it could be land, it could be commercial or residential property, shares, managed funds, superannuation is another important one. It astounds me quite often the number of producers that don't have super. Because at the end of the day, off-property investment really comes into its own when people start looking at facilitating succession planning to the next generation. Those off-property assets can really play a very valuable role. Selling some equity. So for families where the next generation are pursuing other business interests or other careers, but the family that are still on the property, they often tend to be people getting on in years. They're not keen to just exit cold turkey and just leave the industry. They're quite keen to do a staged and managed exit. So this organisation, Cultivate Farms, no doubt there's others out there, so I'm not promoting these guys specifically, but their motto is matching retiring farmers with aspiring farmers. So there could be something in there for producers that are thinking about exiting gradually from the industry. And an important thing is that obviously it needs to be well tied down in terms of agreements and to have quite a robust exit clause in your favour in case things don't work out the way you planned. For people that do decide to exit the industry, the main thing is that hopefully people will have some sort of a well-developed retirement plan in place. I don't imagine it'll be much fun just retiring into town and sitting on a couple of acres with a rider mower, and even though you might have a few cold beers in the fridge, but I think a retirement plan is really essential. So moving on to the options to increase carrying capacity on a property. And often, improving land condition is often talked about, but it does fly under the radar a little bit in terms of it can be an option to increase carrying capacity without incurring a lot of cost to do it. And the main way to do it is to simply follow and adopt what I've called the Grazing Land Management basics. So, for example, matching stock and rates to carrying capacity by doing forage budgets. Incorporating some sort of wet season spelling program in your business or in your grazing management, irrespective of grazing system. The use of fire in terms of a management tool. Most people's experience with fire, I find, in the last probably 30 or 40 years, has been trying to manage fires that they didn't light and that they don't want. But I think there's a big need to actually try and increase the amount of fire that's in the landscape in terms of it being used for management purposes. Things like manipulating pasture composition, providing seed beds for sown legumes, controlling exotic woody weeds, several of which are very susceptible to fire, and managing woodland thickening, which is an increasing issue right across northern Australia. Sown legumes for land or properties that they're in a suitable climatic zone and have suitable land types and soil types. Sown legumes have been shown to be one of the best investments in terms of fairly quick turnaround on additional income from the dollar spent out of all the options for increasing carrying capacity. Usually you get an increase in carrying capacity plus an additional increase in individual animal performance. So there's a double benefit from sown legumes if they're suitable in your location. And the last one is pest management. And the key there is really to work to a pest management plan. I can hear people saying, not another damn plan. But with pest management, if you want results that are going to endure, it is essential that there's a pest management plan that's developed for weeds, feral animals, etc. So the other broad option to increase carrying capacity is actually to adjust or lease more country. And you might think, well, why would I go on adjustment when I'm having a good season at home? Well, a couple of things. I think what you find is when you're having a good season at home, chances are there's other properties in the region that are probably not too far away that are also having a good season. So adjustment may be a bit cheaper than what it is ordinarily, and the adjustment could be quite good quality. It also allows country at home to be wet season spelled during a good season, which will enable a better response and a more rapid improvement in land conditions. So it's a bit counterintuitive, but I know a couple of producers that do it over the years. They've had quite good results. The last one is to purchase more land. And when I showed you that graph of increasing land values with that Heron Todd White rural data, you can see that land values have gone up dramatically. And I realise people are incurring fairly significant debts to take on new land. I think it's essential that people ensure that debts can be serviced even when the trifecta goes pear-shaped. In other words, when cattle prices go down or drought returns, which it invariably will, or the interest rates actually start to rise, which they probably will as well. So moving on, the options to upgrade infrastructure. As I said in my introduction, quite a few improvements on a lot of properties are in fairly ordinary condition, and there's a big opportunity to upgrade infrastructure. So that can be stuff that's actually out in the paddock, because on-ground improvements after the value of the land and the value of the livestock are probably the biggest capital expenditure on most cattle properties. So for fences or any infrastructure, make a fairly determined assessment of whether the infrastructure that's there is serviceable. If it is, continue with maintenance. But if you think it's irreparable, have a critical look at the type of improvement you're going to replace it with and the location. And if you decide, well, it's not in the right place, so I'm not going to replace it there, I'm going to put it somewhere else, try and do something to actually dispose of the material that's there. So rather than leaving fences to decay into the ground, or more importantly, leaving cattle yards to decay into the ground, actually dispose of them. And for cattle yards, there can be some real benefits, because the yards that were built either historically or in the last 40 or 50 years, for the old yards, there could be arsenic residues there from old dips. in the 40 or 50 year time frame going back, there could be other chemical residues. So if you dispose of these things properly, you can potentially head off chemical contamination or residue issues. Distance to water is always a debatable point. So generally people say, well, the more water's the better, but I think it's important that people do a critical assessment of just how far apart they do put waters. And there really is a sweet spot on distance to water. And it depends primarily on two things. First of all, the carrying capacity of the land and the actual cost of providing that additional water. So for light carrying country, the cost of putting water every kilometre would be prohibitive and economically not viable. But on high carrying country, obviously water can be closer together. So do some sort of economic assessment based on carrying capacity and cost. The other thing with upgrading infrastructure is there's a huge array of high-tech information, high-tech technologies that are available, and there's more that are coming down the line. So in terms of connectivity at the property, the options of remote monitoring for water, supplementary feeding points, etc. Virtual fencing is starting to be considered, and some people are starting to implement it. Walkover weighing, I think, has proved itself to be a great benefit. Biometric ear tags are getting close, and more data can be obtained from those ear tags, and the use of satellite imagery for making management decisions. So, for example, the forage that's the forage package, which is available on the Long Paddock website for anyone who wants to have a look at it. And the last one is accommodation. And I think it's important that accommodation, not just for employees, but also for the families that live on these properties, is a high standard. And Tom Mann certainly emphasised this to me when he critiqued this presentation. So make sure there's good capacity with Wi-Fi, surrounds around buildings and quarters, etc., are well landscaped. And the other point Tom Mann made was, he said, make sure they got good beds in them. I think Tom must have spent a fair bit of time in on shearers' beds in his early days in Western Queensland. So moving on to livestock, and people generally, if they've had 1 or 2 seasons that have been reasonable or better, have started to restock, either by buying or breeding up. And with cattle prices, the options for buying back are probably a bit limited. So people are probably tending to breed back, and which is a lower risk option. But for anyone that really is out there buying cattle, I think buying females rather than males is a lower risk option if prices start to slide. Improve the breeder herd efficiency. So there's big gains to be made by producing the same number of weaners, if you like, from a smaller herd, or maybe producing more weaners from a smaller herd. So breeder herd efficiency really flows through the whole business. Well worth considering the options in that area. Better genetics. There's a huge amount of information in there out there about estimated breeding values, or EBVs, and there's actually in excess of 20 important traits that cover things like male and female fertility, growth rates, age to maturity, poleness in cattle, and carcass attributes. But it's important that EBVs are understood before you try and use them. And it's also important to ensure that grazing land management practices and animal health and welfare practices allow for genetic expression. So, for example, paddocks that are bare at the end of the dry season, or cattle that are an animal welfare problem at the end of the dry season, there's no way on this earth that those superior genetics are going to have a chance to express themselves. Environmental management. Water quality is a big issue at the moment, and particularly for reef catchments on the east coast of Queensland. Suffice to say that if grazing land is well managed, by and large, water quality coattails along for a free ride. There are, however, areas where water quality is affected by things like areas of severe degradation, such as what I've called badlands or gullied areas, which I mentioned earlier. And I think for all intents and purposes, all producers can be expected to attempt to do is exclude livestock from these areas. If you're in reef catchments, there may be funding that's available from NRM groups, and even non-reef catchments. Some of those NRM groups have done some gully erosion control work in conjunction with producers. Woody weeds. I talked about a pest management plan earlier, but there's some principles that are important that are followed, and these are what we call integrated pest management. And just to give you an example, using rubber vine was a huge problem in northern Australia, or northern Queensland in particular, before rust became available. When the rust came out, in most years it defoliates rubber vine, which allows things like grass to grow through it, which increases the opportunity to use fire. Rubber vine's highly susceptible to fire. You can get significant death rates, which then enables producers to come in and use herbicides to mop up the plant to the left, put sown pastures in, because usually they're on high fertility soils, and you can turn around a fairly significant weed problem using that integrated approach. So don't just rely on herbicides, for example. And the last one I wanted to raise under environmental management are what we call legacy mine sites. So these are sites that were mined probably in the 1800s or early 1900s. And once again, no one's expecting producers to do anything with these sites except possibly exclude livestock from them. And there can be significant benefit to producers from excluding livestock from these legacy mine sites, particularly if they're old base metal mines like copper, lead and zinc, or they're gold mines, because usually those tailings and those residues have very high levels of heavy metals in them. So you can head off a potential residue risk in livestock by fencing those areas out. And the last category I wanted to cover off on the options to take advantage of the beef industry trifecta are the family and staff. So training is the big one. There's a massive array of training opportunities out there, like formalised type training online and face-to-face, offered by the government departments, West Australian and Northern Territory and Queensland Departments of Agriculture or their equivalent. There's a range of very good consultants out there that are offering programs. So take advantage of it and have a talk with your staff and your family members about what your needs may be. On-the-job training is always going to be important, but one thing I want to expand a little bit on is occupational health and safety. If we go back 2 generations to probably the 50s and the 60s, the industry in Australia that had the worst occupational health and safety record was the mining industry. In the intervening decades, that has improved dramatically. There's still room to move in every industry, including the mining industry, but they really have lifted their game dramatically. Unfortunately, now the industry that's got the one of the worst records in occupational health and safety is agriculture. And out of all the industries in agriculture, the beef industry has got the worst track record. So I would emphasise that there's a big opportunity there to improve occupational health and safety for your family members and your staff and for yourselves. And the last one I wanted to raise was succession planning. So it's a huge issue. In my experience, I think producers and the rural families are getting better at succession planning, because once again, there's a lot of information, a lot of consultants and experts offering a service to help people go through succession planning. I just wanted to highlight one that I found on the Grains Research and Development Corporation website, and I was quoting a consultant called Andrew Beattie from Pro Advice. And once again, I'm not promoting his particular service. There's plenty of consultants out there. But some of the points he raises when doing succession planning is to separate the succession plan from the estate plan, because they're different. He emphasises that people matter most, so start with needs and objectives. Time frame is important. Take your time and don't barge through. Allow for a balance of flexibility and certainty, and ensure education on the future implications of the plan is well understood by people involved in the succession operation. It goes through and understand the what ifs, and he talks about the D words: death, divorce, disagreement, disability. So they're all very confronting, but they can have a major effect on succession, and they need to be covered in there in case one of those unfortunate incidents actually does arise. Agreements need to be formalised, And the last one is succession is a process or a journey, not a destination. So I think there's plenty of food for thought there. So just in conclusion, the trifecta really is a rare occurrence. So I think for most producers, it may occur only once in their tenure on their property. If they're really lucky, they might crack it twice, but once I think is probably about all that's going to happen for most producers. The best options really are seldom clear cut. So access expert advice. So that's in terms of technical advice, in terms of financial advice, in terms of legal advice. Access people with life skills and facilitation skills to help you go through some of these this process to identify options. And lastly, there's a lot of people out there have tried a lot of things. Some have had success, some haven't. So seek those people out, and they might be able to mentor you and help you on your way through. So that's where I'll finish it. Thanks very much, Nicole. And I'll just add at the end just a bit of a plug. As I said at the start, this presentation was given at a Australian Rangelands conference in Longreach last year. There's other presentations that are really quite relevant for producers and other people involved in extensive beef production. The next Rangelands conference is in Broome in September next year, 2023. So that's something to look out for to pick up more information on rangelands and extensive pastoral management. Thanks very much, Nicole.